Hello, and welcome to my podcast where I discuss the origins of all sorts of things. I'm your host, Danny Payne, and this is On the Origin of Everything. To kick off summer, today I'm talking about the origin of Smokey the Bear. Only you can prevent forest fires. It's a slogan and a character we all know, but there's so much about Smokey's story that is less known. For example, this campaign to prevent forest fires started out as wartime messaging. And the original character wasn't a bear at all. It was a character that we are all 100% familiar with, though. And did you know that Smokey was a real person? We're going to get into all that today. So put out your fire responsibly, and let's get started. Smokey the Bear is the longest-running public service campaign in U.S. history. The simple message is that by being more careful, we really can prevent a lot of wildfires. This is a noble initiative at face value, but this fire prevention campaign started out as a wartime measure to protect timber resources during World War II. I don't know about you, but when I think about World War II, I don't think wood. I think heavy metals and rubber. And thinking back to our Tupperware episode, I remember that the production of polymers was ramping up during World War II as well. But natural materials were still in heavy use during the war, including wood. Wood was being used for bridges, railroad ties, gun stocks, ships, docks, barracks, and other buildings. But the biggest single use of wood was packing crates to ship military supplies. I sort of forget that we used to ship everything in boxes or crates made of actual wood. I'm reminded of that Indiana Jones scene where the Ark of the Covenant is sealed in a wooden crate and hidden away in a massive government warehouse that's full of wooden crates. But anyway, wood was a strategic war commodity. This is why a national fire prevention push made sense. As I was learning about this, I wondered when we started caring about forestry. Because if I remember correctly, Europeans arrived here and swiftly began to ecologically eviscerate the land wherever they went, killing wildlife for food and furs, and cutting down forests for firewood, building material, and to clear land for agriculture. Forests were treated primarily as resources to be used, not conserved or managed with sustainability in mind. The scale of 19th century logging and land conversion prompted growing alarm among naturalists and early conservationists who warned of a looming timber famine. The visible depletion of forests in eastern states and the Great Lakes region helped spark conservation conversations. One such conversation took place at the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, where multimillionaire George Vanderbilt in the 1890s brought European forestry practice to America by hiring Gifford Pinchot to oversee the sizable grounds of his estate, covering 125,000 acres. I've actually been to the Biltmore Estate. It was one of our stops on our honeymoon trip. The mansion is what you're really there to see. 250 rooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, an indoor pool, bowling alley, a gym, a huge library, a pipe organ, and a bunch of other stuff I'm sure I'm forgetting. But it was at this Biltmore Estate that the first professional forester was hired in the United States to oversee the Biltmore Estate. This was also the location of the nation's first forestry school. German forester Carl Alvin Schenk established the Biltmore Forest School in 1898, creating a model for training professional foresters. Those private experiments in sustained yield thinking, selective cutting, replanting, and watershed protection helped normalize the idea that forests could be managed for long-term public benefit rather than simply liquidating them for short-term gain. At the federal level, the shift accelerated under Theodore Roosevelt and his ally Gifford Pinchot, who institutionalized scientific forestry by creating and expanding the U.S. Forest Service in 1905 and moving forest reserves into active management, growing the national forest system dramatically and embedding multi-use stewardship into federal policy. Those educational and institutional advantages, the first professional foresters, the first forestry school, and a national agency charged with stewardship, meant that when war arrived, the country already had the people, the policies, and the public framing needed to mount a nationwide civilian fire prevention campaign. After the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1941, the following spring brought Japanese submarine shelling near Santa Barbara, California, close to Los Padres National Forest, fueling fears that incendiaries could ignite catastrophic coastal fires while trained personnel were deployed overseas. More men fighting in the war meant fewer firefighters available, so civilian prevention measures became a practical strategy. Aside from the loss of precious lumber, the smoke produced by wildfires disrupted military flying operations. In one instance, smoke from a forest fire caused the loss of more than 10,000 flying hours in a single aviation camp and interrupted anti-aircraft defense training. In that context, the Forest Service and its partners organized the Cooperative Forest Fire Prevention Program, or the CFFP, specifically to warn the public that forest fires could undermine the war effort. The CFFP began to run a poster campaign to build public awareness and participation in wildfire prevention. The earliest posters used patriotic, war-related themes to deliver the message. One poster from 1943 used enemy caricatures with the words, "Our carelessness, their secret weapon. Prevent forest fires." Using patriotic propaganda during a world war against clearly defined enemies is typically an effective tactic, but from what we learned in the advertising episode, people are more likely to remember a message and are more likely to act on that message if the campaign is led by a character. The CFFP had established urgency, but urgency doesn't always equal persuasion. To change behavior on a massive scale, the message had to be memorable. It needed to find a way for people to make an emotional connection with it, and that didn't come in the form of a bear named Smokey, not yet. It came in the form of an unexpected but familiar deer. A deer named Bambi. In 1943, the Walt Disney Company gave the CFFP permission to use not only Bambi, but his forest friends Thumper and Flower too, on a fire prevention poster. The poster depicted those three well-known characters with the caption, "Please, mister, don't be careless. Prevent forest fires. Greater danger than ever." This was a huge hit. The movie Bambi had come out the previous year and was fresh in everyone's minds. So to see those pop culture icons on a fire prevention poster essentially saying, "Help prevent forest fires because we can't, and we live in the forest," was an effective call to action. The message was far-reaching and proved the effectiveness of selling cooperation with lovable characters. A great lesson to learn, because the license to use Disney's Bambi characters had an expiration date. The loan term was only 1 year. They got a lot of miles out of that 1-year period, but as the deadline approached, the CFFP had a clear choice to make. They needed to create their own character, a mascot that they could keep forever. Let's take a short break right here, and when I come back, we'll learn how the CFFP landed on Smokey the Bear, and how this campaign evolved from wartime necessity to a peacetime public service campaign that became the longest running in American history. Don't go anywhere. This episode is brought to you by you. Only you can prevent ads on this show. Don't be careless. The danger is greater than ever. Click the Patreon link in the show notes to donate, or go to patreon.com/ontheoriginofeverything. Another way you can support the show is by giving it a 5-star rating and review, or by following it, or by sharing it. Let's build a community of people that are curious and always learning. Now, back to the show. When Disney's 1-year Bambi loan ended, the U.S. Forest Service, state foresters, and the War Advertising Council needed a mascot they could control long-term. In a letter written by Richard Hammett, the director of the Wartime Forest Fire Prevention Program, he described the agreed-upon animal, a bear. In this letter, he stated what the bear should look like: a short snout, appealing, knowledgeable, and quizzical, and possibly wearing a campaign hat. Foot, Cone, and Belding of Los Angeles became the volunteer advertising agency on this project. Artist Albert Stehla, a well-known commercial illustrator, is credited with producing the first Smokey Bear image on October 10, 1944. It depicted a brown bear wearing a forest ranger's hat and blue jeans, pouring a bucket of water onto a campfire, with the caption, "Smokey says, care will prevent 9 out of 10 forest fires." And that's how Smokey the Bear was born. But where did the name come from? Smokey wasn't a bad choice considering the campaign he represented, but it was more than just a cute name. Smokey was a nod to a real firefighter, Joseph "Smokey" Joe Martin of the New York City Fire Department. He had risen through the ranks for his bravery and leadership, repeatedly risking his life fighting fire after fire, and was even hospitalized a number of times. In one dramatic instance known as the Greenwich volcano, he was literally blown through the door of a building from an explosion. One reporter stated that after being blown through that door, the mayor asked him how he felt and he said, "Fine," and then fell unconscious. When he regained consciousness, he was urged to go home, but he refused and proceeded to command the firefighting crew from a stretcher. On another occasion, the fire chief ordered everyone out of a burning building, realizing the futility of their efforts, but Joseph Martin continued to fight the fire. The chief had to go back into the inferno to pull him out of there. As they exited the burning building, they were met with reporters on the street who had witnessed the whole thing, and the chief presented Joseph Martin to the reporters by saying, "Gentlemen, this is Smokey Joe Martin." And the nickname stuck. And so Smokey Joe, a figure already associated with fighting fires, became the inspiration for Smokey the Bear's name. The marketing campaign for Smokey continued to evolve with new and improved illustrations, along with a more effective tagline. Smokey's early messaging used "Smokey says, care will prevent 9 out of 10 forest fires," using a statistic to persuade the public to be more careful. But in 1947, the Wartime Advertising Council added the line that turned wildfire prevention into a personal assignment. Remember, only you can prevent forest fires. This effective change reframed the issue from a public one to a personal one. The new tagline was so memorable that in later years, the campaign didn't even need the full sentence. They could just release a poster with Smokey the Bear saying, "Remember," or "Only you," and people understood the full message. One campaign booklet reports that 95% of people could finish the line when prompted with "Remember, only you," and 98% could recognize Smokey from his picture. Now that's a successful marketing campaign. But it wasn't just about awareness. The campaign generated participation too, with hundreds of thousands of kids joining Smokey's Junior Ranger program. It was pretty inspiring. Jumping ahead a little, in 2001, the tagline was updated to replace forest fires with wildfires. Only you can prevent wildfires, conveying the need to prevent all unwanted human-caused fires. Smokey the Bear is, of course, a fictional character, but he's named after a real firefighter and would later become a real bear. In early May of 1950, 2 fast-moving fires burned through thousands of acres in the Lincoln National Forest in New Mexico. While crews fought the flames, they found a tiny black bear cub clinging to a charred tree, alive but with badly burned paws. The crew initially called him Hotfoot Teddy, but as the news of the cub spread quickly, the public and the press soon began calling the rescued cub Smokey Bear, after the campaign character. And that poor little black bear became the physical embodiment of Smokey the Bear. So what happened to him? the little bear. Well, after rescuing him from the fires, Game Warden Ray Bell arranged emergency veterinary care in Santa Fe and then took him home where he and his family helped nurse him back to health. Ray Bell later offered Smokey to the U.S. Forest Service on the condition that he be used to promote conservation and wildfire prevention. After recovery, Smokey was flown to Washington, D.C. to be installed as a living mascot at the National Zoo, where he lived for 26 years and received so much mail from the public that the Postal Service had to assign him a special zip code. The rescued cub turned an already effective advertising symbol into a tangible, sympathetic figure. Smokey was no longer just an illustration on a poster. He was a real bear you could go to the zoo to see, turning an abstract poster campaign into something physical that people could connect with, cementing the slogan and imagery in American culture for generations. Congress later went as far as protecting the Smokey name and image with the Smokey Bear Act of 1952, making it illegal to manufacture, reproduce, or use the Smokey Bear character or name without government authorization. So Smokey the Bear's name and image was put into federal law. America really cares about its fire prevention mascot. The story of Smokey the Bear traces how a handful of firsts, the hiring of trained foresters, the founding of the Biltmore Forest School, and the creation of the U.S. Forest Service, recast woodlands as a shared, managed resource rather than the false premise of an endless supply. That shift set the stage for a wartime prevention campaign that spoke to both patriotism and stewardship. The rescued cub that became the living Smokey Bear and the legal protections that followed turned a poster into the promise that if we take care of the land, it will take care of us. Smokey's lasting message is less about blame and more about responsibility. Small acts of care that add up to real protection for forests, animals, communities, and the resources we still depend on. And that's the origin story of Smokey the Bear. I was going to end this episode by sharing fire prevention tips, but it turns out that there are like 1,000 things you can do to prevent an accidental fire from happening. It's like, instead of life finds a way, it's fire finds a way. So we gotta be really careful out there. Don't burn things during a burn ban. Don't flick your cigarettes out your window. Build your campfire right and extinguish it correctly. All that good stuff. But there are so many more ways to be careful, so I recommend Googling it. But that's it for today. I'll see you back here in a couple of weeks with another random origin. Can't wait to see what Jess picks for the next one. Until next time, so long. Research, music, and production was all done by Jezere Wilson. This podcast is listener-supported, owned and operated by Jez and myself under the On the Origin of Everything, LLC in the United States. All rights reserved. We can be reached via email at info@ontheoriginpod.com.